Now, having looked at some major avant-garde movements in photography from the early 20th century, Dada, Surrealism, and the photography of the Bauhaus with the machine aesthetic, we can come back to August Sander and Eugene Atget and see them a little bit closer to the way that they were seen in their original context. So Atget was active in Paris in the 19th century, and as his work continued from the 1890s through the 1920s, his working methods didn't really change. He continued to use large glass plates and to print on albumen paper, sometimes called printing out paper, which is printed in direct sunlight and not with an enlarger. And this is while gelatin silver printing using an enlarger has caught on with the young generation, and that's what really feels modern to people. So his style, it seems to people, really old fashioned. He photographed the street scenes of Paris and the surrounding areas, usually absent of people. You'll see photos of his with people in them, but he's best known for his vacant street scenes. He was tremendously prolific, made over 8,500 photographs, and he sold his work as documents for artists. That was how he made his money. He didn't make very much money, but he became popular among modern photographers when he was so-called discovered by Man Ray and Bernice Abbott. I mean, the younger generation sort of discovered him. He'd been around for a long time. Then this was towards the end of his life. So this is the sort of street scene that Atget is known for. A view of a restaurant. You can see a waiter on the other side of the window, but you can also see reflections, very subtle, sort of clouding up the view. This is the kind of thing that the surrealists particularly loved about Atget's photography because he's capturing scenes from everyday life in Paris. These are the things that people see on their everyday walks around the city. But because he's doing it when he can be by himself, when he can focus and slow down and compose things very carefully, he's capturing these strange juxtapositions and reflections and things that are just sort of like overlaying the modern world and the human body and mechanization and everyday activity. This is sort of exposing what the surrealists called the optical unconscious, the sort of strange things that sort of run as an undercurrent in our daily lives and habits. So his photographs, they're different aspects of city life, including things like this, carnivals when nobody's around, cafe tables and street scenes that are just waiting for the day's customers to come by. By showing the sorts of environments where people circulate, he's really capturing a lot that's valuable to street photographers because it's just the kind of everyday things that people take for granted and so don't bother to record. And then in the photographs, you sort of notice things you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. This is a photograph that in his archive he had made hand notations on the backs of many of his photographs. And on this one, he wrote, "This is a place that's going to disappear." So, and it's true that it did. And he was living in a time when modern methods of design and urban planning were leveling buildings and leveling entire city blocks in order to modernize people's ways of life in their homes. So he was careful to pay particular attention to things that he knew weren't going to be around much longer. So his photographs capture these elements of daily life. They capture elements of things that were going to disappear, and they do it with this kind of atmosphere and strategic approach to composition and capturing these very gentle, very subtle effects of light and atmosphere that are just very highly prized by photographers today. And these were the portrait photographs that were taken by Bernice Abbott that helped to contribute to Eugene Atget's reputation when his photographs were published in book form. He didn't survive to see the fame that his photographs gained in the United States and in Europe after they were published. But Bernice Abbott knew what people would see in those photographs. For her part, she loved his appeal to the sort of surrealist side, but she was especially interested in how it captured the feeling of the city and the identity of the city by focusing on the buildings and the environment. And she took that as inspiration and advanced it forward with her photography of New York City in the years that followed. Now let's take it back to August Sander, photographing in Germany during this period of time, a little somewhat overlapping with Atget's career. So he's photographing in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s and thereafter. During the 1920s, he's working on a project that he calls the People of the 20th Century, and that's a very broad project. A certain segment of it, a selection of photographs from that, was published as The Face of Our Time. And that was a fragment of his effort to document the true face of the German people. And that, as a book, it was published in 1929. His strategy is what we now call a typology. He tried to sort of divide his sense of who the German people were into 7 broad categories of people that were then broken up into many, many more subcategories that were related to their ethnicity, their class, and their profession, and other sort of demographic qualities. His project was put to a halt by the Nazis in the early 1930s. Some of his negatives and printing plates that had been hidden managed to survive the war, and others were destroyed. These are a few of the best known images from his People of the 20th Century. So you can see the young farmers from 1914, some boxers in the middle, and this photograph of the notary in his fading jacket on the right. So you see with each of his photographs, he wants to photograph people in an environment that says something about their occupation, their livelihood, where they spend their time. They're portraits that say something about the person because of what they do, and what they do is integral to who they are in Saunders' point of view. The bricklayer you see on the left and a pastry chef on the right, each of them photographed doing the thing that, in Saunders' view, makes them who they are. And some of his portraits are of people in a domestic environment, like the young mother with her little baby and their pet. So Sandra's goal was to capture images of people from all segments of German society. And that included people who mainstream Germans might have thought of as fringe characters, dancers, circus performers, like you see here. A lot of people who didn't have jobs, people who were destitute, and people who were handicapped, all played roles in his photographs, because he wasn't passing judgment on these people. He was saying, these are the people of our time and our place. Let's look at one another. The kind of respect and egalitarianism that Sander brought to his approach to photography was not compatible with the Nazi view of how Germans should see one another. It was part of the Nazi ideology that all people were not equal and were not all deserving of the same amount of respect or of the same rights. The Nazis believed that you could tell a lot about a person from things that you could see in a photograph. So the kinds of strategies that we saw in forensic photography in the late 19th century are carried over into the Nazis' use of photography for documentation in the 20th century, and they used those photographs for propagandistic purposes. So part of the Nazis' information campaign is to convince the German people and make these images pervasive around them to remind them of what the good Germans look like and what the wrong Germans look like, or people who don't deserve to be considered Germans look like. So they would have these public exhibitions to show people photographs of the Jewish types so that they would be able to visually recognize Jewish people around them in order to be able to root them out. And on the right, you see a two-page spread from a handout that accompanied their exhibition of degenerate art. They're making visual comparisons between modern art of their time and the kinds of people that the Nazis believed were degenerate and needed to be rooted out of society. So yeah, they had very clear ideas of what kinds of people deserved respect and which kinds of people did not. And photography played an important role for them in disseminating those ideas. Photography played an important role in pushing back against the Nazis as well. And what you see here are photo montages by John Hartfield, and they're published in a Workers' Party newspaper that's being printed by this time outside of Germany, but then is distributed in Germany as well as elsewhere in Europe. And so he's using the techniques and tools of photomontage created during the Dada years, but it's evolved to this point to be a format that he can use to put ideas out in the world. So here on the left, you see Hitler giving that salute, that is that gesture that's so familiar to Germans at that time, raising the arm, but the way that Hartfield gives it to us here, he's just reaching up for a great big fat handout from big business that's standing behind him and backing him up. So he's a little man with a big gift. On the right, you see, as in the Middle Ages, so in the Third Reich, just putting the Nazi symbol, the swastika, in a visual parallel with the instruments of torture from the Middle Ages. So this is avant-garde tactics, the strategy of photomontage being used for very deliberate presentation of ideas.